September 21st, 1945. Camp Deming, New Mexico. The dust settled on Georg Gartner's boots in fine layers, reddish-brown against the scuffed black leather. He stood at the fence line, fingers wrapped around the diamond-patterned wire, and watched the American Guard yawn. Beyond the perimeter, the desert stretched toward mountains that changed color with the light, purple at dawn, burnt orange at noon, deep crimson now as the sun descended. 378 days he had counted these sunsets. 378 days since they had pulled him, half dead, from the rubble of his own certainties. The wire was warm under his palm, not electrified, not even particularly well maintained. The guard, a farm boy from Iowa named Peterson, who sometimes shared cigarettes and talked about his father's corn harvest, carried his rifle with the casual indifference of someone guarding men who had already surrendered. This lack of vigilance both baffled and disturbed Gartner. In the Wehrmacht, such negligence would have meant court-martial. Here it meant something else entirely, something he was still trying to understand. Behind him from the mess hall came the sound of laughter, German laughter mingling with the clatter of aluminum trays and the smell of roasted chicken. Chicken, on a Wednesday, with mashed potatoes and green beans and apple pie for dessert. Gartner's stomach had long since stopped its initial revolt at this abundance. The body adapts faster than the mind. He remembered hunger, real hunger, the kind that makes you eat bark and consider your leather belt as potential sustenance. He remembered it as recently as 18 months ago, when his unit had been retreating through France, living on whatever they could scavenge from abandoned farmhouses. He remembered the metallic taste of fear that accompanied every meal, wondering if it would be his last before an Allied shell found him. And then the shell had found him. Sarneno. The world had split open with sound and fury. Gartner, then a 23-year-old Gefreiter in the 302nd Infantry Division, had been crouched in a concrete bunker overlooking Omaha Beach when the naval bombardment began. The shells came in waves, each explosion compressing the air in his lungs, making it impossible to breathe, to think, to do anything but press himself against the cold concrete and pray to a God he had been taught to replace with the Führer. For 6 hours they had held, 6 hours of gunfire so constant it became a single continuous roar. The Americans kept coming, wave after wave, falling on the beach like scattered toys, but always more behind them, always more. The propaganda had promised that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that the German soldier was worth 10 Allied soldiers, that victory was inevitable and ordained by history itself. The propaganda had not mentioned what it felt like when the concrete above you cracks, when the steel reinforcement bends like wire, when the ceiling becomes the floor and the floor becomes a coffin. Gartner had awakened in darkness, unable to move his left leg. The weight of rubble pinned him, and the darkness was absolute, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of burial. He could hear muffled sounds above, boots crunching on debris, voices speaking in a language he had been trained to associate with subhumanity, with the mongrel degeneracy of a doomed nation. English, American English, with its flat vowels and careless consonants. Terror gripped him then. Not the terror of death, but the terror of capture. They had been told what would happen. The Americans, they said, tortured prisoners, executed them on sight. The Jews among them were especially cruel, seeking revenge for imagined grievances. The Africans among them were barely human, and all of them were under orders to show no mercy to the soldiers of the Reich. So when the rubble shifted and light stabbed into his tomb, when hands reached down to pull him free, Gartner had expected the bullet, the bayonet, the casual violence that marked the end of captured enemies. Instead, he received morphine. The American medic, Gartner never learned his name, had been young, perhaps 19, with a face full of freckles and hands that moved with surprising gentleness. "Easy there, buddy," he had said, even though Gartner spoke no English then. "You're going to be okay. We got you." Through the haze of pain and shock, Gartner had watched those hands work, cutting away his torn uniform, examining the compound fracture where white bone had punctured through flesh, starting an IV line, injecting morphine, calling for a stretcher, moving with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, many times, for many men, regardless of which uniform they wore. There was no interrogation, No beating, no mockery. The medic treated him exactly as he had treated the American soldiers lying nearby. Some crying for their mothers, some silent with the special silence of men who would not see another sunrise. They carried him to a field hospital, a cluster of tents behind the beach, where doctors in blood-stained whites moved between operating tables, like priests conducting rapid, desperate rituals. Gartner had expected to wait, to be left in a corner until the American wounded were treated, or perhaps to be left indefinitely, allowed to die from neglect, if not from direct violence. Instead, a surgeon appeared within minutes. Compound fracture, left tibia and fibula, the medic reported. Possible internal bleeding. He's been under rubble for approximately 4 hours. The surgeon, older, with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen too much in too short a time, nodded. Let's get him on the table. Check his blood type. Gartner, fading in and out of consciousness, felt himself lifted onto a surgical table. The last thing he remembered before the anesthesia took him was the surgeon's voice, tired but professional. He's just a kid. Let's save his leg if we can. He's just a kid. Not, he's just a German. Not, he's just a Nazi. Not, he's just the enemy. He's just a kid. 3 words that changed everything. Gartner released the fence and walked back toward his barracks. Around him, the camp sprawled across 15 acres of New Mexican desert. Row after row of whitewashed wooden buildings, a mess hall that could seat 500 men, recreation areas with volleyball nets and horseshoe pits, even a small theater where they showed German-language films on Saturday nights. 412,000 German prisoners of war had passed through American camps during the war. 412,000 men who had expected death and received something infinitely more confusing: normalcy. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that prisoners of war be treated humanely, fed adequately, housed decently, and paid for their labor at the same rate as soldiers of the capturing nation. But paper requirements and actual implementation were usually separated by a vast gulf of cruelty and indifference. In the East, where German prisoners fell into Soviet hands, the convention might as well have been written in invisible ink. Of the 3 million Germans captured by the Soviets, fewer than half would see home again. But here in America, the convention was followed with an almost perverse literalism. Gartner earned 80 cents a day working in the camp's vegetable garden. 80 cents, exactly what an American private earned. The money accumulated in a camp account that he could use to buy cigarettes, candy bars, toiletries, even magazines from the camp store. The food was abundant to the point of obscenity. Meat at every meal, fresh vegetables, milk, coffee with real sugar, on Sundays, ice cream. The first time they had served ice cream, Gartner had wept. He wasn't alone. Dozens of men, hardened soldiers who had survived Stalingrad, North Africa, the Normandy invasion, had broken down at the sight of ice cream. Not because it was ice cream, but because it represented something they had been taught could not exist. An enemy with enough resources to waste food on prisoners, an enemy strong enough to be generous. The propaganda had prepared them for everything except abundance. In Barrack 7, where Gartner bunked with 35 other men, the afternoon was dissolving into evening routines. Hans Müller, a former Oberfeldwebel from Munich, was writing a letter home. The censors would read it first, but they would not confiscate it unless it contained military information or criticism of the United States. Otto Zimmermann, who had been a violinist before the war, was tuning his instrument for the camp orchestra's evening practice. They had a full orchestra: violins, cellos, clarinets, trumpets, all provided by the American Red Cross. On Thursday nights, they gave concerts. Sometimes American civilians from the nearby town of Deming came to listen. This confused Gartner most of all. Citizens of the nation they had been trying to destroy, paying money to hear them play Beethoven and Brahms, applauding, shaking their hands afterward, thanking them for the beautiful music. Georg, Friedrich Schmidt, a farmer's son from Bavaria, called from his bunk. "Are you playing soccer tomorrow? We need a goalkeeper." Soccer. They had a soccer league. 5 teams organized by region of origin: Bavaria, Prussia, Rhineland, Saxony, and Austria. They played every Sunday afternoon. There were uniforms, referees, a scoreboard. American guards sometimes joined as spectators, cheering impartially, sometimes even betting cigarettes on the outcomes. Maybe, Gartner replied. He sat on his bunk and pulled off his boots, setting them carefully beside the footlocker where he kept his few possessions. 3 changes of clothes, toiletries, a Bible he never read, and a small photograph of his mother that had somehow survived the journey from Germany. His mother. She would be receiving his letters by now, carefully neutral letters that passed through multiple layers of censorship. Letters that said he was alive and well treated, but could not say that he was questioning everything he had ever been taught. Could not say that the Americans, far from being the degenerate mongrels of propaganda, seemed cleaner, healthier, more efficient, and infinitely more wealthy than anything he had known in the Reich. Could not say that he was beginning to suspect they had been lied to about everything. For Gartner, the crack had appeared in the field hospital, widened during his transfer to a POW camp in England, and become a chasm when he arrived in America. But cracks can be plastered over, doubts can be rationalized. The mind, confronted with evidence that contradicts its deepest beliefs, will perform extraordinary gymnastics to maintain those beliefs, until it can't. The breaking point came in October 1945, 6 weeks after the war had ended, when the Americans began their program of re-education. It started with a film. All prisoners to the theater at 1900 hours, the announcement came over the camp loudspeakers. Attendance mandatory. They filed in 500 men, joking and speculating. Perhaps it was another newsreel about the war's end, or maybe an American propaganda film about democracy. They had seen those before, earnest productions about the American way of life, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Most of the prisoners found them amusing. Democracy, they had been taught, was the disease that preceded a nation's death. Only strong leadership, unified purpose, and racial purity could build a lasting state. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred to life. The first images were familiar. Barbed wire, guard towers, barracks, another camp. But something was wrong. These prisoners were skeletal, barely human, their eyes enormous in shrunken faces. They wore striped uniforms. They moved with the shuffling gait of the nearly dead. The camera panned across piles of corpses, hundreds, thousands, stacked like cordwood. A bulldozer pushed bodies into a mass grave. British soldiers, their faces frozen in expressions of horror and disgust, stood watching. A title card appeared. Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, April 1945. The theater had gone silent. More images followed. Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria with ovens still full of bones, mountains of shoes, glasses, hair, human hair, shaved from corpses, piled in massive bales for industrial use, gold teeth extracted from the dead, melted into bars, and the survivors, living skeletons who stared at the camera with eyes that had seen things beyond description. Children who looked like ancient prophets. Women whose bodies had forgotten how to weep. In the darkness, Gartner heard men vomiting. Some were crying. Others sat in stunned silence. A few stood and tried to leave, but American MPs at the doors turned them back. "You watch," and they said. "You need to see what you did." What you did. But Gartner had done nothing. He had been a simple soldier, fighting for his country, following orders. He had never been to a concentration camp, had never participated in atrocities. He had fought honorably within the rules of war against legitimate military targets. Hadn't he? The film continued. A British officer, speaking in accented German, explained what they were seeing. The systematic murder of 6 million Jews, the industrial efficiency of death, the carefully maintained records showing how many died each day, how much Zyklon B gas was needed, how long it took to cremate a body. And then the part that shattered Gartner's remaining defenses. German civilians from nearby towns, forced to tour the camps after liberation. Their faces showed the same shock, the same disbelief, the same visceral horror that Gartner felt now. They hadn't known. How could they not have known? The answer was because they, like him, had chosen not to know. After the film, they were given books. American books, translated into German. Books about democracy, about human rights, about the history of totalitarianism and how it corrupts everything it touches. They were given newspapers, German-language newspapers printed in America, filled with testimonies from survivors, photographs from the camps, transcripts from the Nuremberg trials where Nazi leaders defended their actions with the same bureaucratic precision they had used to murder millions. Some men refused to believe, called it propaganda, clever fabrications designed to break their spirits. These men, fanatics, true believers, formed their own groups within the camps. They terrorized those who wavered, who dared to question. There were beatings in the night, acts of sabotage, even murders. Werner Drexler, a young sailor who had cooperated with American interrogators, was beaten to death by 7 fellow prisoners at Camp Papago Park in Arizona. They hanged him with a noose made from torn bedsheets, a warning to anyone who might be tempted toward collaboration. The camps became microcosms of Germany itself, a battle between those clinging to the old certainties and those beginning to embrace new possibilities. Gartner found himself in neither camp. He was adrift, unmoored, suspended between a past that now seemed monstrous and a future he could not imagine. He worked in the garden, played occasional soccer, attended the orchestra concerts. He read the newspapers and books they provided, absorbing information like a man dying of thirst, even as each fact drove another nail into the coffin of his former beliefs. At night, he lay awake and reconstructed his life. Every assumption, every certainty, examined and found wanting. They had been told they were the master race, but the Americans treated their African soldiers with casual equality that would have been unthinkable in the Wehrmacht. They had been told democracy made nations weak, but America had outproduced Germany by margins so vast they seemed like fantasy. 100,000 tanks to Germany's 25,000, 300,000 aircraft to Germany's 100,000. They had been told they were fighting for civilization itself. But civilization, he now understood, does not build death camps. The worst part was the memory of his own complicity. He had never killed a Jew, never participated directly in atrocities, but he had heard the jokes, the casual dehumanization. He had known that Jews were being resettled and had not asked where or how. He had accepted the absence of Jewish soldiers in the Wehrmacht, Jewish neighbors in his building, Jewish students in his school, without questioning what their absence meant. He had chosen not to know because knowing would have required action, and action would have meant becoming the enemy of the state he had sworn to serve. Now that state was ashes, and he was left with the question, what do you become when everything you believed was a lie? 3 years had passed since the war's end. Most of the prisoners had been repatriated, sent home to a Germany divided and ruined, where cities were rubble and hunger was once again a daily companion. But some remained, either because their home regions were now under Soviet control and they refused to return to communism, or because they had nowhere to go, or because, and this was rarely admitted openly, they had come to prefer their captivity in America to freedom in Germany. Gartner was scheduled for repatriation in 2 weeks. His papers were processed, his transport arranged. He would be shipped to New York, then across the Atlantic to Bremerhaven, then released into the ruins of his homeland to build whatever life he could from the wreckage. He didn't want to go. This realization came to him gradually, like dawn in the desert. First a subtle lightening of the darkness, then an unmistakable truth that could not be denied. He had spent 3 years in America. He spoke English now, haltingly but adequately. He understood this strange, contradictory country with its abundance and its racism, its democracy and its segregation, its idealism and its pragmatism. More importantly, he understood that in Germany he would always be what he had been, a soldier of the Reich. Here he could become something else. The question was how. He began to pay attention to the camp's perimeter in a new way. The fence was still not electrified. The guards were still casual. The desert beyond offered both hiding places and deadly exposure. Camp Papago Park in Arizona had experienced a mass escape in December 1944, when 25 German prisoners had tunneled out. Most had been recaptured within days, but one man, Georg Gartner's namesake, Georg Gartner, had vanished completely. Gartner began to collect information, guard shift schedules, The timing of supply truck arrivals and departures, the patterns of searches and roll calls. He studied maps of the surrounding area, memorizing the locations of towns, roads, rail lines. He saved his camp earnings, accumulating almost $200 over 3 years. Enough for a bus ticket, some civilian clothes, a few weeks of survival if he was careful. He told no one. Trust, he had learned, was a luxury that led to betrayal. In the barracks at night, while other men snored or whispered about their hopes for return, Gartner lay silent and planned his disappearance. The irony did not escape him. He was about to escape from a prison where he had been fed, housed, educated, and treated with more dignity than he had shown to those his nation had deemed subhuman. He was about to become a fugitive in a country that had saved his life and changed his mind. But the alternative, return to a Germany where he would forever be a reminder of collective shame, where every interaction would be shadowed by the question of what he had done, what he had known, what he had failed to prevent, was unthinkable. Better to disappear, to become someone new, to build a life unhaunted by the past. On September 21st, 1948, exactly 3 years to the day after he had stood at the fence watching the sunset, Georg Gartner walked away from Camp Deming and into 40 years of invisibility. It happened during the evening meal, when 500 men crowded the mess hall and attention was diffused across multiple points of chaos. Gartner had volunteered for kitchen duty that week, which gave him access to the service entrance and the garbage truck that made its daily run to the town dump. He waited until the truck was loaded, until the driver, a civilian contractor named Bobby who listened to country music on a portable radio and never looked twice at his cargo, climbed into the cab. Then Gartner slipped into the truck bed, burrowing beneath bags of kitchen waste, and held his breath as the vehicle passed through the camp gate. The guard waved them through without inspection. Why inspect garbage? At the dump, Gartner waited until Bobby had driven away, then emerged from his malodorous hiding place and walked calmly into the gathering dusk. He wore civilian clothes purchased secretly over months from the camp store. Denim pants, a cotton shirt, a canvas jacket. His camp earnings were in his pocket. His English was good enough to pass for a German immigrant, of which there were millions in America. His plan was simple: get to California, find work, disappear into the vastness of a country that stretched 3,000 miles from ocean to ocean. He walked through the night, keeping to side roads, moving west by the stars. At dawn, he reached a truck stop outside Las Cruces and used precious dollars to buy breakfast and coffee. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a tired smile, asked where he was heading. "California," he said, "looking for work." "Lots of folks heading that way," she replied. "War's over. Everybody's looking for a fresh start. You got people out there?" "No people, just possibilities." She smiled at that. "Well, good luck to you, honey. Hope you find what you're looking for." It was the first of 10,000 interactions that would follow the same pattern. Casual kindness from strangers who had no idea they were aiding a fugitive. Americans, Gartner would discover over the next 40 years, were almost aggressively incurious about other people's past. In a nation of immigrants and migrants, of people constantly reinventing themselves, questions about where you came from were considered rude. What mattered was what you could do, what you were willing to work for, who you chose to become. This cultural amnesia about origins was both America's greatest weakness and its greatest strength. It allowed criminals to escape justice, but it also allowed the broken to rebuild themselves. Gartner hitchhiked to California, worked a series of manual labor jobs: construction, farm work, warehouse loading. He moved frequently, never staying more than a few months in one place. He used his real first name, but changed his surname frequently. Sometimes Gartner, sometimes Gardner, sometimes other variations that sounded American enough to avoid questions. The FBI searched for him, of course. His escape was noted, his description circulated. But one German among millions of immigrants was nearly impossible to find, especially when that German was actively trying to disappear. The Bureau had other priorities: Soviet spies, communist infiltrators, organized crime. An escaped POW who wasn't committing crimes, who was simply working and keeping his head down, was not worth extensive resources. So the search gradually faded. The file remained open but inactive. And Georg Gartner became Dennis Wiles, then Danny Gardner, then David Gaines, accumulating social security numbers and driver's licenses and employment records under various names, building a precarious existence in the margins of American society. He never married. Intimacy required trust, and trust required honesty, and honesty would mean revelation. He had acquaintances, but no close friends. He worked hard, paid his taxes, violated no laws except the fundamental one of being present without permission. He read voraciously, newspapers, books, anything that would help him understand this country where he had become an unauthorized resident, and slowly, over decades, he became American. Dennis Wiles, the name he had used for the last 17 years, sat in his small apartment and watched the news. President Reagan was giving a speech in Germany, marking the 40th anniversary of the war's end. The camera showed elderly German veterans, some weeping, some stone-faced, all haunted by memories of battles won and lost, of comrades fallen, of a nation that had embraced evil and paid an incomprehensible price. Gartner was 64 years old now. His left leg, shattered by rubble at Normandy and rebuilt by an American surgeon, ached in cold weather. His hair was silver. His face was creased by decades of sun and wind and the weight of carried secrets. He had lived in America for 40 years, 27 of them legally as a prisoner of war, 13 of them as a fugitive. He was tired. The secret had become heavier with each passing year. In the beginning, fugitive status had been a necessity, a survival strategy. But over time, it had become a cage more confining than any POW camp. He could never relax, never fully trust, never reveal his true self to anyone. He had built a life, but it was a life constructed on foundations of deception, and those foundations were crumbling. The previous year, Congress had passed a law offering amnesty to German POWs who had remained in the United States illegally after the war. It was a minor provision, tucked into a larger immigration reform bill, but it represented a lifeline, a chance to emerge from invisibility, to trade false names for legal status, to finally, after 40 years, tell the truth. But to accept amnesty meant facing the past, meant admitting who he had been, what he had done, why he had run, meant acknowledging that he had been a soldier of the Reich, even if he had never personally committed atrocities, meant confronting the judgment of a nation that had every right to see him as an enemy who had violated their hospitality. For weeks, Gartner wrestled with the decision. Then on a cold morning in April 1985, he walked into the offices of the Immigration and Naturalization Service in Denver and spoke words he had not said aloud in 40 years. "My name is Georg Gartner. I escaped from Camp Deming in 1948. I would like to surrender." The INS agents were young, too young to remember the war, too young to carry personal grudges against German soldiers. They took his statement with professional detachment, processed his paperwork, and informed him that he would need to appear before an immigration judge. The hearing was scheduled for September 19, 1985. Gartner hired a lawyer, a young woman named Patricia Stevens, who specialized in immigration cases. She listened to his story without judgment, took careful notes, and built a case for leniency. "You've been here 40 years," she said. "You've worked, paid taxes under your various identities, violated no laws except immigration laws. You're not a criminal. You're just someone who overstayed his welcome by several decades." "I was a soldier in the German army," Gartner replied. "I fought against America. Some people will say I shouldn't have been allowed to stay at all. Some people will say lots of things," Stevens agreed. "But the law is clear. The amnesty provision covers your situation. You should be fine." Should be. Those two words carried a universe of uncertainty. The hearing attracted media attention. Not extensive. This was a minor human interest story, not front-page news, but enough that reporters waited outside the courthouse, their cameras ready, their questions prepared. Who was this man who had hidden for 40 years? What had his life been like? Did he regret his service to Nazi Germany? Did he regret escaping? Did he regret surrendering? Gartner, dressed in a cheap suit purchased specifically for this occasion, walked past them without comment. Inside, the courtroom was small, functional, fluorescent lit. The judge, a man in his 60s named Harold Morrison, had been a young lieutenant in the Pacific Theater during the war. He might have personal reasons to view German soldiers with less than sympathy. The hearing was brief. Stevens presented evidence of Gartner's employment history, his tax payments, his lack of criminal record. She argued that he had lived as a productive member of society, harming no one, simply seeking to build a life in a country that had treated him with unexpected dignity during his captivity. The prosecutor, a tired-looking man who seemed to regard the whole proceeding as a waste of time, made a perfunctory argument for deportation, but without much conviction. German war criminals were being pursued, yes, but Georg Gartner was not a war criminal. He was simply a soldier who had fought, been captured, been treated well, and chosen to stay. Judge Morrison listened, made notes, and finally spoke. Mr. Gartner, you violated your terms of captivity by escaping. You violated immigration law by remaining in this country illegally for 37 years. These are serious offenses. Gartner stood silent, waiting for judgment. However, Morrison continued, the Congress has seen fit to offer amnesty for cases such as yours, and I see no reason to override that judgment. You will be required to apply for legal permanent residency through the proper channels. If that application is successful, you will be permitted to remain in the United States. If it is denied, you will be deported to Germany. Do you understand? I understand, Your Honor. Good. This hearing is concluded. It was over in less than an hour. 40 years of hiding concluded with a few words from a judge who had other cases to hear that afternoon, more important matters to address. Outside, the reporters were waiting. Mr. Gartner, why did you escape? What was it like, living in hiding for 40 years? Do you regret fighting for Nazi Germany? He stopped, considered, and finally spoke. I was a soldier. I followed orders. But I learned while I was a prisoner that the orders I followed were evil, that the cause I fought for was monstrous. I escaped because I was afraid to face that knowledge in Germany, where everyone knew what we had done. Here I could become someone new. But you cannot become new while living a lie. So now I tell the truth. I was Georg Gartner, soldier of the Wehrmacht. I am Georg Gartner, American resident. I hope to become Georg Gartner, American citizen. If that is possible, do you think America should forgive you? He thought about that question for a long time. Thought about the American medic who had injected him with morphine instead of leaving him to die. Thought about the surgeon who had saved his leg. Thought about the camp where he had been fed and educated and treated with dignity. Thought about 40 years of kindness from strangers who did not know they were helping a fugitive. America already forgave me, he said quietly, in 1944, when they saved my life instead of taking it. I am only now learning to forgive myself. Georg Gartner received his permanent residency in 1986. He lived quietly in Denver until his death in 1988, 3 years after his surrender. He never became famous, never wrote a memoir, never sought public attention. He worked until his health failed, paid his taxes, and died as he had lived the last 40 years, without fanfare, without drama, simply as a man who had once been something terrible and had chosen to become something better. His story, when it is remembered at all, is remembered as a curiosity, the Nazi who escaped and hid in plain sight for 40 years. But this framing misses the deeper truth. Gartner's story is not about escape. It is about transformation, about what happens when certainty meets contradiction, when propaganda meets reality, when the enemy turns out to be more humane than your own side. It is about the 400,000 German prisoners of war who passed through American camps and emerged changed. Not all of them changed. Some clung to the old beliefs, carried them home, passed them to their children. But many, perhaps most, experienced the same cognitive dissonance that Gartner felt. They had been taught that democracy made nations weak, but they saw a democracy that had outproduced, outfought, and ultimately destroyed the regime they served. They had been taught that Jews and Africans and Slavs were subhuman, but they saw Jewish doctors treating their wounds, African soldiers sharing their rations, Americans of every background working together with casual efficiency. They returned to Germany carrying seeds of democracy that would slowly, painfully, grow into the Federal Republic, a nation that would spend decades confronting its past, teaching its children about the Holocaust, building memorials to its victims, ensuring that the phrase "never again" was more than empty rhetoric. This transformation was not automatic. It was not painless. Germany struggled with its past, denied it, rationalized it, and finally, grudgingly, accepted it. The seeds planted in POW camps were only one factor among many, but they mattered. Every German prisoner who returned home, having seen that the enemy was not monstrous, that democracy was not weakness, that abundance was possible without conquest, each one was a living refutation of Nazi ideology. Gartner, in his own strange way, was part of this transformation. He absorbed American values not through the re-education programs, but through 40 years of living in a society that, for all its flaws, operated on principles radically different from those he had been taught. Individual freedom, equality before the law, if not yet in fact, the possibility of reinvention, the belief that what you do matters more than where you came from. He died believing in these principles, not perfectly, not without awareness of America's contradictions and failings, but genuinely. And that belief, purchased at the price of 40 years of hiding, was the final stage of his transformation from soldier of the Reich to American resident.